when Abalone ruled the world, the Monterey was the center of the universe, and it truly was. And but it goes back a long way. Let's see if we can start from the beginning here. So actually, the first abalone fishermen in Monterey actually were the native people, the Indian people of Monterey, who were the Rumsian people. Rumsian is the language they spoke, and we can trace the native culture into the Monterey area about 10,000 years or so. And abalone played a very important part of their life. They ate it. They used the shells to make tools like fish hooks and shovels and bowls. They used the shells to decorate baskets, to make jewelry, and they traded to other California Indians for things they could not get here in Monterey, like obsidian, which is a volcanic rock, which they're using like arrow points and spear points. And perhaps some of you out there in today's audience remember that old Kevin Costner movie called Dances with Wolves. Yeah, that movie. Is about Indians in South Dakota. If you watch that film closely, and it comes on cable TV all the time, so it's difficult to miss. If you watch that film closely, you'll notice a lot of abalone in the clothing and the regalia that they're wearing. Well, as far as I know, there is no abalone in South Dakota. It's got to get there some way, right? It's going on these trade routes. A lot of it, most of it, starts right here in Monterey. And Monterey literally was the abalone capital of the world. They have found California Monterey red abalone in midden sites as far back as Minnesota. This is a wonderful drawing of a Monterey Rumsian woman. This was done by an unknown Spanish artist in the 1790s. And what I love about this drawing is it really shows the connection to the bay here. So the inner skirt here would be made of tules. This outer skirt is made out of deer hide. These black spots you see along here would be large abalone pendants. The cape that she's wearing is probably sea otter pelt. And the necklace that she's wearing is olivella shell, little sea snails. And if you look closely here at her earpiece, let's look at a close-up. This is what she's wearing in her ear is this piece right here. This is a photograph I took a few years ago at the British Museum in London. And this piece was collected here in the Monterey area in the 1790s by a pretty well-known British explorer named George Vancouver. And you can see that it is partially woven like a basket. At one point, it had acorn woodpecker feathers in its weave. Then the large white beads are clamshell disc beads. The white beads here are olivella shell bead, some glass trade beads, abalone pendants. Then this long piece here, this is bird bone. Of course, bird bone is hollow. And then they create this design that we would now call scrimshod, and they'll use squid ink to get that dark color. And then she'd keep it in her ear. You can see she'd wear it as a pair, right? So she'd keep it in her ear like you'd put a pencil back behind your ear. That's how she keeps it here. And oftentimes, as they weave these beautiful baskets, they'll weave into the basket beautiful abalone pendants, clamshell disc beads, olivella shell bead. So the bay is very important and abalone in particular, very important to the native people of Monterey. In fact, the word abalone comes from the Rumsian people. They had a word for the red abalone, which is the predominant abalone in that bay out there. That word is Alun, A-U-L-U-N. And then linguists have traced that word abalone back to that word Alun that starts right here in Monterey. So this is my friend Linda Yamane. Linda is a Rumsian descendant. And probably the world's leading scholar, actually, on the Rumsian people. She has worked the last 30 some odd years bringing back language, songs, stories. She is the very first Rumsian Ohlone basket weaver, probably in 150 years. And you can see all the abalone regalia that she's got here. And then this is a piece that Linda made for a museum that's in Japan today, based on a historic piece. Again, olivella shell bead and abalone and clamshell disc beads, and of course, beautiful abalone pendants you see right there. And then here's one of Linda's beautiful baskets, feathered basket with olivella shell disc beads here, and then here's our abalone pendants hanging from the basket right there. Very cool, right? Let's go. Let's jump into it here. So it really wasn't until the 17th. There was a group of of course, Chinese fishermen arriving here in the mid 1850s, arriving here, brought the Chinese to Monterey, actually was abalone. In fact, the San Francisco newspapers referred to it as the abalone rush. But then they eventually ventured out and began to fish everything that was out there in the Monterey Bay. But they weren't divers. They were getting abalone from what they could get from the tidal zones. And they also would use big kind of viewing boxes with big long poles with knives on the end of that, pry abalone off the rocks that way. It really wasn't the most effective way to get abalone, but it really wasn't until the 1890s when this gentleman arrived here, Japanese gentleman named Otto Sabaru Noda, immigrated to Monterey. He got a job working for then land arm of the Southern Pacific Railroad, the Pacific Improvement Company. Noda-san got a job working kind of like a labor contractor and kind of a lumberjack. He was up in a tree one day near the Monterey Wharf, looked down into the harbor and just saw all this abundance of abalone. So much abalone, he actually described it in a letter as being a carpet of abalone, and nobody's doing anything with it. And the reason nobody's doing anything with it, because nobody knew what the heck you're supposed to do with it. Unless you're preparing abalone properly, it is kind of like eating a rubber boot. The Japanese who've been dealing with abalone for centuries, they knew what to do with it. So Noda-san writes a letter back to the government of Japan, said, hey, all this abalone here, nobody wants it. The government of Japan sends this gentleman right here. This is Jinosuke Kadani, who was in the abalone business in the Chiba Prefecture of Japan. He comes over and goes, oh, man, this is great. Here's a close-up of our Mr. Noda here. And by the way, this photograph was taken on Adams Street today, if anybody knows Monterey. And this is actually where the Captain Stoker's coffee shop is. And this is a group of Japanese businessmen known as the Japanese Association. And this picture was taken about 1908. And then here's Jinosuke Kadani, early when he first came into Monterey. Handsome young man right there. So Noda, or Kodani, sent for abalone divers known as AMA, or free divers. In between this time, Noda went down to what's now present-day Cannery Row and leased a piece of property down there. If you know Cannery Row today, there's an empty lot down there right next to the El Chorrito restaurant. We're planning to build sort of this marketplace thing. It's been in the plans for many years now. And he leased that piece of property, sent back to Japan for other fishermen, and created a sort of small Japanese fishing colony on that site. And these abalone divers, these AMA divers, came into Monterey. We know who they were. We actually have their names. They arrived here about 1896. They came into San Francisco, got on the Del Monte Express, down to Monterey, picked up at the Monterey train station, taken to Noda's site on Cannery Row. That first morning got dressed in the traditional AMA gear, which you can see consists of this little white cotton outfit here. Here's the abalone basket, abalone pry, a pair of goggles you see right here. If you look closely here, they had put pig's bladders on the end of these things that they would squeeze to help release the pressure. They got dressed up first morning, went off into the Monterey Bay, jumped into the water, and about 10 seconds later, they jumped back out and they said, Kadani-san, you didn't tell us how cold that water is. There is about a 15-degree water temperature difference between Monterey and Japan, which is a huge water difference. By the way, this is the site. This is the site where Noda opened his first fishing colony. You see right here. Maybe you'll all recognize this site here. Eventually, of course, canneries were built here on this very site as well. It was the old Del Monte Foods cannery at one time. And there's our Kodani, who eventually moved over around the peninsula, eventually ended up in Point Lobos, partly because he wanted to get away from Monterey. He wandered into Point Lobos, running a great deal of Japan. And in fact, I bring my Japanese friends when they come to California, come to Monterey, I'll bring them over to Point Lobos. And that's always the first thing they say, how much it looks like home. And he leased a small piece of property out there at Point Lobos. Is that whole was a diving place today. He leased that piece of property and created an abalone business. He leased this piece of property from this gentleman right here. This is Alexander McMillan Allen. A.M. Allen was a mining engineer who'd come to Monterey in the 1890s to help run a coal mine that they had out at Point Lobos. And they're producing sort of low-grade coal, and they weren't making a lot of money at it. So the company decides to sell the property. The plan was to sort of break it up and sell it for home lots and then create a little town out there at Point Lobos. But it wasn't selling very well. I mean, no one wanted to live out there. It was sort of isolated. You know, you're away from Monterey. I mean, there wasn't any mass transit to get back and forth. And so it just wasn't a big sell. And so Allen thought there was something better we could do with this property. So he bought the rest of the land from his partners. They went and bought all the property that had already been sold. And it was Allen who preserved it. So you can thank A.M. for what Point Lobos looks like today. But he leased that small piece of property to Kodani and then watched his operations for about a year and then said, you know, I think there's money to be made here. And so he joined Kodani and became his partner, and they worked together. Allen was a pretty progressive thinker for his time. So here's a photograph of the Point Lobos Canning Company. So beginning around the turn of the 20th century, really about 1903 or so, they began to can abalone as well, because what they were doing initially is they were drying all that abalone, because there was no local market for it. There was no Western market at all for it, because no one knew what to do with it. There were people and restaurants that were trying to experiment with it, and they would initially put it in burlap sacks and pound it until it was just mush, or they would use different kinds of lyes they'd pour on it to try to soften it up, but nothing really kind of worked well for it. And so the Japanese market really, as they were drying it and shipping it back to Japan, or they're shipping it to China. They're also shipping it to Australia, and they were shipping it to Hawaii. There was a large Japanese Chinese community that lived there that would buy it. Dried abalone is a prized possession, the prized commodity in Asia, in particular in Japan. Dried abalone to this day is still very special. It's considered to be good luck. In fact, you buy New Year's cards or birthday cards, wedding cards, oftentimes there'd be strips of dried abalone glued inside the card. But they began to can it, and they're cooking it in the can. They were steaming it like they were cooking canned sardines. And so they thought they could sell the canned product to the Western audiences, and but still was a hard product to sell. So they were shipping the canned product also to Asia, but that just wasn't a big market for it. They didn't want the canned product. They wanted the dried product. So Noda, besides the abalone, realized the abundance of Monterey and salmon fishermen. They began to fish salmon in Monterey Bay around the turn of the 20th century. We think of Monterey fishing today, we mostly think of Monterey sardines. Of course, the sardine fishery was the largest fishery of a single fish in the history of the United States, but it was salmon that put Monterey on the map, and it was Japanese fishermen that were doing this. This photograph was taken in 1909. At the end of this 1909 salmon season, and these are Japanese fishermen here, at the end of this 1909 salmon season, Monterey Daily Cypress, which was the big newspaper in Monterey at that time, salmon boats working in Monterey Bay. And 145 of them were Japanese owned. And they're catching an average of 1 million pounds of king salmon in 3 months. 1 million. This 1909 salmon season, they caught 1,500,000 pounds of king salmon. In 1915, they caught 2 million pounds of king salmon in the Monterey Bay. Huge, huge fishery. So this is a beautiful illustrator, a wonderful artist, and you may have seen this before. It's part of a mural that appears on the old Noah building in Pacific Grove, but sort of up for sale, I believe, right now. See Pacific Grove, I understand, hoping to buy it, turns into an art center. And when they mural, and this is an illustration of a AMA diver. Of course, this is a woman AMA diver that you see here. And we don't know if there are women AMA divers in Monterey. They certainly were in Japan. They still are in Japan. They still dive the same way as they did here at the turn of the 20th century. But we do have a report from 1903 from the Japanese government. And it was not uncommon to send emissaries to California, in particular to Monterey, to see how the people were doing. And this gentleman was here in 1903 and wrote a report of a company in Monterey that employed women divers. There are no photographs of them. If they were here, they were only here for like one seat that they were. And I guess they probably were here. And maybe those pictures will show up in Japan someday. So Noda, besides starting the abalone fishery, starting that salmon fishery, then on that very site opened a cannery in 1903, the Monterey Fishing and Canning Company. He worked with a guy named Harry Malthus. Harry Malthus was an American who worked for the Point Lobos Canning Company, managed that. It only operated until 1907, but what's important about this cannery is it's the very first sardine cannery in Monterey proper. So the Booth Cannery actually opened a little bit before that, and the H.R. Robbins Cannery opened before the turn of the 20th century, but they were in New Monterey, and this is the very first cannery in New Monterey. It was Japanese owned on what's now Cannery Row. So, as I mentioned, AMA, it was tradition, and there were a number of divers that continued to dive AMA style. In fact, they did it into the 1920s, and how they would operate, they operated in pairs, and they got into the boat, and on the middle of the boat, there was usually a barrel where they kept the fire going all the time. And the diver would get ready to dive. They would tie a rope around his waist, which they ran through this pulley system that was on the boat. And he would go into the water and he'd follow the anchor line down. And those guys they'd go down 30 or 40 feet into the Monterey Bay. Now, some of those guys could hold their breath up to 3 minutes. 3 minutes. And then when they're ready to come up to the surface, his partner on the boat would take the other end of that line, which had a weight tied around it, usually just a big rock, and throw it over the side of the boat, and then pull that diver to the surface, where he'd get to the surface and he would warm himself up by the fire while his partner went in and started collecting abalone. But really, before the turn of the 20th century, they began to experiment with the AMA diver. They could stay in the water much longer. I mean, they could be down there for hours at a time. And so here's a wonderful photograph of early helmet divers. In fact, we know this is really early because you look at the helmet, there's no dents on it. So we know these are new gear right here. You can see that's Kodani you see right here. And this actually was taken at Point Lobos. And so, and they would get dressed in their heavy canvas suits and about 65 pounds with the lead weight to the front and back, lead to their shoes, the big brass helmets, and then of course it has the hose attached to it, 40, even 50 feet into the Monterey Bay. The deeper he went, the harder it was to pump. Then the air diver with the motor, now that diver's going 30, 40, 50, in some cases up to 100 feet into the Monterey Bay. But at that level, number one, you can't see anything, and you can't stay down there very long. So you work your way up very slowly to this 30-foot level. They could be down there all day collecting abalone. So here's another early picture of the diving operations at Point Lobos. Again, you can see the two divers in the water here. And again, look at the helmets. There's no dents on these helmets. A lot of these are brand new gear from Japan. There was a company in Tokyo that was making this gear, and then they're having it shipped to California to Monterey. Of course, these divers are coming to California contracts, and they then returned to Japan. Jinosuke Kadani's brother, named Nakajo Kadani, was actually a trained and went back to Japan and worked on that side of it, where he was the guy signing divers up and sending them to California. These boats they're using here actually are converted whale boats. So many of you may know there was an active whaling industry. You're good. You all can see all the pictures, John? Okay.
Yep.
Good. So this is a picture of one of those abalone divers, Mr. Watanabe, who came to Monterey in 1906. And if you look at this picture closely, of course, she's all dressed in Western style clothing. And then down below, your picture, you can see was taken in Monterey, here's another one of those pictures. I forgot. Another one of those abalone divers, Mr. Kawagami. Mr. Kawagami's story is kind of interesting because he was not a diver in Japan. In fact, was a rice farmer. And they all come from an area in Japan, a town called Shirahama. And it's a very small community, and they all knew each other. And he knew all these guys, and he saw these guys all going off to California, going to Monterey. He said, man, I want to do that. Young guy, kind of adventurous, going off to a foreign country and everything. So they signed him up, put on a ship, sailed across the Pacific, comes into San Francisco in December of 1907. He's on the train, the Del Monte Express, comes down to Monterey, gets picked up at the train station, taken out to Point Lobos. With the day of arriving, with no experience whatsoever, he's diving abalone. He hated it. But he loved living here. Ended up spending about 20 years here. He could read and write, which was really unusual at that time. He also he read letters for the divers. He wrote letters for the divers. He became a bookkeeper for the divers. He also became a jewelry maker of Monterey red abalone that he was selling to the tourists that were coming out to Point Lobos, going on that 17-mile drive. If you look closely here in this photograph, you can see the watch fob that he's wearing. This is heart-shaped. It's made out of Monterey red abalone. The family still has that watch fob there. Here's a photograph taken early on, about 1910 or so. And here is Mr. Kawagami, Mr. Watanabe. Here's Jinosuke Kadani on that hand pump you see right there. Very cool picture right there. And so, as you probably all know, there was a great deal of anti-Japanese sentiment in the United States at that time. And there's a lot of suspicion about what these guys were doing out there in Monterey Bay, because no one ate abalone. There was no market for it on here. What are they doing out there? This is a newspaper, a story that actually was sent all over the United States. I actually found this from the Montgomery, Alabama newspaper in December of about 1906 or so. It says, Jello spies work the bay. And what this story actually is saying is that they don't believe they're actually hunting or fishing for abalone. But what they were actually doing is that they were mapping the bay, preparing Monterey and Santa Cruz area. So the Japanese army would land at Santa Cruz, then march to San Francisco and take California. And this story actually went all over the United States. That's what they're convinced they were going to do out there. So here is a label from the Point Lobos Canning Company that they're for the Western market that they're trying to sell it. Again, of course, they work with a chef from the Hotel Del Monte for different abalone soups and abalone salads and different kinds of things. A beautiful label. But again, the canned product was never a big sell. In 1913, the state of California actually made it illegal for the Japanese to export dried abalone out of the state. They could send the canned product, but they couldn't send the dried product. But again, the canned product just wasn't popular in Japan. They wanted that dried product out there. Here is the label for the Japanese label that they were sending into Japan for that product. This is a photograph. I put this in here. This is a photograph of a French diver. This was taken about 1995, and he's diving off the Solomon Islands. In 1786, a guy by the name of Lobos who was a French explorer, a French scientist. The French government sent a large scientific expedition into the Pacific. What they really were doing was looking for whaling grounds. Whaling was drove the economies of the world in those days. But they were into the first real expedition into the Pacific to really map and chart and to visit all these different places. And they came into Monterey. They had the crew. There were botanists. There were biologists. There were map makers. All kinds of different scientists are aboard the ship, and they spent about 10 days in Monterey and collected all kinds of things while they were here. And then they left Monterey. They directly went across the Pacific and ended up in Asia. When they got to China, there was a ship, a British ship there, and Laprousse decided to transfer a number of the things that he had collected so far on his expedition. And he had been in Alaska, he'd been in South America, and he also transferred his logbook at that point onto this British ship that did make it back to Europe and then transferred those things to France. He also sent a young lieutenant, left him ashore in China, and said, "Find your way back to Paris." And he loaded him up with all kinds of things. He eventually did find his way back to Paris. It took about a year. He had to go through Siberia to get there. Then Laprousse's expedition continued, eventually ended up in Australia, then off the coast of the Solomon Islands, got caught in a storm, and the ships were destroyed, and they sunk, and they disappeared, and nobody knew what happened to them. It was a huge mystery for many, many, many years, especially in France. I mean, Laprousse to this day was a national hero in France. And in the 1950s, they found the shipwrecks again off the coast of the Solomon, small island in the Solomon Islands there, and they began to excavate those shipwrecks. So about 10 years ago, I was in Paris, and I went to the big maritime museum that's there. That, by the way, Laprousse was the very first director of that maritime museum. So I was looking for things about Laprousse because that was a story that always fascinated me. And they didn't really have a whole lot at that time in the museum, but they had an exhibit about him recently. And they showed me this big, beautiful coffee table book that they had in their gift store about the Laprousse expedition and about the dive on the wreck that's going on. And so I bought the book. It was in French, and I unfortunately don't read French, but I certainly understood the photographs. I was going through that book. I see this photograph. I thought, look at that diver. In his right hand, he is holding a Monterey red abalone shell that came obviously from here. That's where Laprousse collected this shell, and then unfortunately ended up in the Solomon Islands. So I had this idea that maybe we could work with the French government, we could bring this shell and other artifacts to Monterey. And so a couple of years ago, I contacted the French consulate in San Francisco. They put me in touch with a museum in the South Pacific near these islands here. That it's a French museum that has all these artifacts, and we began this dialogue, and they agreed to send these things back to Monterey for an exhibit. And then the pandemic hit, and we weren't able to do it. So hopefully the next couple of years, we can go back to that story and bring this thing back to Monterey. All right, so I digress. So here is another part of our big story here. So this is a guy named Papa Nostalter, who was a German restaurateur. As I mentioned, abalone, there wasn't a real Western market for it. I mean, so the really Japanese market was in Japan. And once the United States cut off California cut off the Japanese from sending dried abalone out of the state, really kind of hurt their market, hurt their business. Pop Ernest came to Monterey in 1907, opened a small restaurant down there on Alvarado Street, a kind of a small European bohemian style restaurant called the Cafe Ernest. And the idea was people would come and spend the whole evening in the restaurant. And he was fast with his abalone thing. So he brought into his restaurant one night and experimented with it and finally come up with the famous recipe. You slice the foot, because that's what eating abalone is, the foot. pound it to make it soft. And you don't just pound it, there's a certain technique to doing that. Then he ran it through egg wash, cracker crumbs, and cook it up quickly in olive oil. And soon people came from all over to eat fresh abalone steaks in Pop's restaurant. They'd sing songs and write poetry. Like some folks boast the quail on toast because they think it's Tony, but I'm content to owe my rent and live on abalone. George Sterling wrote that in his guest books in 1913. His first restaurant, of course, was the Cafe Ernest. Oysters is what he was selling initially. The oysters that he was selling were coming from San Francisco, and they'd come by train. If you know anything about trains, trains aren't always reliable. Sometimes trains break down. There's cows on the track. And of course, oysters, like any seafood, particularly shellfish, don't stay fresh very long. And so oftentimes, by the time they got to Monterey, they'd be spoiled. And that's what we had to thinking about abalone. This is up in front of his restaurant on Alvarado Street, right after he opened it. And then here is the interior of that restaurant, Cafe Ernest, that you see right there. Then here he is. He's the guy in the back. And then all the waiters. And this young lady right here, this is his daughter. This is his son, Carl, and the son, Pop Jr. over here. They all work, or this is Pop Jr. here, all working in the restaurant for him there. So besides his restaurant, he also worked as a caterer. He catered all kinds of different events. And he was well known amongst the Bohemians that had come to California, come to Carmel, came to Monterey. He knew them from San Francisco. He was particularly well good friends with George Sterling, who was king of the Bohemians. And Sterling came to Carmel and began to cook abalone on the Carmel Beach. They were the ones who began to pound it and create that Abalone Song, Carmel Beach. And this is a photograph taken at Point Lobos of Pop catering an abalone feast at Point Lobos with all those Bohemians. And in this photograph, you're going to find George Sterling and Mary Austin, and Jack London is probably in this photograph. All those guys are in it. And there's Pop right there. And then here is his guest book from 1913. And you can see right down there, right here is the Abalone Song with George Sterling, the beginnings of the Abalone Song anyway. George Sterling wrote that first, although we think a woman by the name of Opal Heron actually wrote this. This is the most famous verse of the Abalone Song. He wrote it down, but we think it was Opal Heron that actually wrote that verse. The family still has these guest books, and there are literally hundreds of these written in their guest books there. So in 1913, Pop was offered so much money to leave his Monterey restaurant and come to San Francisco and go to work for a restaurant called the Hofbrau. And so he closed his restaurant in Monterey, packed up his family, packed up his abalone recipes, and he moved to San Francisco and began to work at a restaurant called the Hofbrau, sort of a German restaurant, but really catered to the tourists in San Francisco. And it was actually on the corner of Market and 4th Street. It's in a big building called the Pacific Building. The building is still there. You go there today, there's a big Nordstrom's in there, and on the top floor, there's a big movie complex. And down in the basement today, there's a big food court down there, exactly where the Hofbrau restaurant was at the basement, where that food court is down there. And if you look at this menu here, glued down the bottom, this is Abalone Specials. So they would promote it every week. They'd put this ad in the San Francisco Chronicle. The cleanest, wholesomest shellfish is the abalone. It clings to the rocks and feeds on seaweed and mosses. We get them daily by express, directly from Point Lobos. Canned, packed in seaweed, they arrive here, not only fresh, but alive and kicking. And then here is that close-up of that menu: abalone cocktails, abalone salad, abalone nectar, which is just the juice that came out of the shell. And by the way, that's 25 cents, which actually was a lot of money in 1913 to do that. But Monterey, or abalone, was still kind of a tough sell in those days, no pun intended. So in 1915, something happened. There's a picture, by the way, of the Hofbrau restaurant. It was a restaurant and it had all these different rooms. And this is the beefsteak room, probably where they served abalone. In this room right here, this is one of the rooms right there. So in 1915, one of our divers, this is a diver, Mr. Watanabe, And in his dive suit, you can see the shoes that are just tied on right there. This is a photograph of where these divers come from. As I mentioned, they all come from a town called Shirahama. This is a contemporary photograph. This is the Abalone diver's house. What was a diver's house in Shirahama. You can see it there. And then here is the going into the front door of that house on the base of this mountain right here. And there's a large Buddhist temple on the top of the mountain right there. And then inside the house, and I've been into many of these homes on this little town here. Every single house I went into has these shrines to Monterey. I mean, to this day, they have these shrines to Monterey. Look at these abalone shells here. These, you could take a bath in this shell. That's how big it is. They came out of Monterey well over 100 years ago. This shell is huge right there. And then this doll you see right here was purchased at Home's department store in 1927. Today, a family heirloom. This is Mr. Kawagami's house, actually, in Shirahama that you see right there. Another one of those things that happened, this is what's known as Maiwai. These are indigenous to that part of Japan. And that's a fishing community. And it's actually a big peninsula and a number of little towns around it. The big city is Tateyama. And I've worked with a museum there in Tateyama on a couple of different things. I worked with them on an exhibit about 10 years ago about abalone as food and beauty. And the fishermen would get these pieces of fabric at the end of a good season. And then they would turn them into these jackets, which they'd wear at ceremonies, at Buddhist temples, and different kinds of special things. Because see, this one's rather special. Has the American flag, Japanese flag. It says E-Day and Company, Monterey, USA. This one was from here. We had no idea these things existed. The museum I work with had hundreds of these kinds of jackets in their collection. And they said, wait a minute, we got this one from Monterey, and they pulled one of these out like this one. As far as we know, there are only 2 of these that exist today. There's one on exhibit at the museum in Tateyama, Japan, and then there's this very one you see here that's now on exhibit, I'm proud to say, right here in Monterey at the Japanese American Citizen League Hall Heritage Museum. And it was given to us by the family, the Kurohawa family, whose the granddaughter gave it to us. Her grandfather was one of the very first helmet divers. In fact, he was the first helmet diver to come to Monterey in 1896, and this was his. We think less than 10 of these were ever made, and they never actually, they were something they would have gotten when they returned to Japan, but we brought this back to Monterey. I'm happy to see it. We actually had it reproduced, and we work with a Maiwai maker in Japan, in Shirahama. He's the last of the traditional Maiwai makers, and this is the one we had reproduced. You can see how beautiful it is, how bright, beautiful blue it is. He and his whole family spent about 2 years making this for us. And we have this also on exhibit here. But if you look at this one, Mrs. Kurohawa was very embarrassed about it when she gave it to us because it's faded and dirty and it's torn. And she explained to us that after World War II, her family was destitute. This is all they had to wear. And so we were very honored to be able to get this. So, and this is when A.M. Allen died in 1930, the family, the community of Shirahama was so honored by the fact that he was employing all these men from that town who was then sending money home that kept their families alive, that they held this memorial for A.M. Allen at the temple that's at the top of that mountain of Mr. Kawagami's home. So here is a photograph. So the memorial service for the late Mr. A.M. Allen. That's actually, I think, an amazing thing. There's the Kajiro Kadani right here, and there's Mr. Kawagami right there. I've been to this temple, still looks just like that today. Actually, an amazing thing. Unfortunately, Janosuke Kadani passed away actually a few months after this, and they also held another service for him as well, the same place there. So the Hotel Del Monte, very important to the story, opened in 1880, bringing tourism to Monterey. The tourists, of course, were collecting abalone shells to send home to their families or to bring back as a souvenir. They're venturing into the town of Monterey where they're going into Pop's restaurant beginning about 1980, eating abalone dinners and beginning to spread the word of eating abalone steaks all over the world. And also in 1915, the San Francisco opened the Panama Pacific International Exposition, a World's Fair, to honor the opening of the Panama Canal that opened just a couple of years before. And if you know San Francisco, and I'm sure most of you do, the Palace of Fine Arts was built for that World's Fair. In fact, the whole area of San Francisco was just a big mud flat, and it was filled in for this World's Fair. About 600 acres was filled in. And all kinds of things are introduced to this World's Fair, all kinds of new products, automobiles and motorcycles and food products. Every state was represented, all kinds of countries were represented. California had the biggest of the California state buildings. It was 5 acres in size. Every county is represented in the California State Building, and every county had their own exhibits. Let's take a visit to the World's Fair. Here's our ticket. We'll go inside. Let's go visit that California State Building. We'll visit the Monterey County exhibit. Here is the Monterey County exhibit, part of it anyway, and you can see, it's like Monterey, the Mission County, but look at this, all this sea life that you see here, all these abalone shells you see right here, and then there's the abalone diver in the case right here. You can see right here what an amazing thing that is. Here right there, let's take a look at the other side of it. Now here's the back side. Here's our abalone diver in the case. The canned abalone you see all the way along right here. Again, all the abalone shells that they're promoting right here. All the fish here, the sun star here. Anybody who old enough to remember the old Pacific Grove Museum of Natural History, and if you went in there when I was a kid, in the main room, they had a big underwater exhibit, and this is it right here. So after that World's Fair, they sent this to Pacific Grove, and that became the underwater exhibit right there. So here is the Point Lobos Canning Company exhibit at that World's Fair, and they're giving away canned abalone as souvenirs to the tourists. Here's the abalone dive helmet, the beautiful shells. Some of these are half polished. In fact, the Pacific Grove Museum of Natural History actually has these shells in their collection, these very shells in their collection. And then they're then sending folks down to the Hofbrau restaurant for full abalone dinners, and soon the whole world wanted this. Hotels, restaurants, all want this new sensation, abalone. Pop says there's money to be made here, and so he actually quits the Hofbrau restaurant and moves around the corner. So here, another product, by the way, that was introduced to that in that World's Fair was Monterey Sardines. This is a business card for the Booth Cannery. A can that I found on eBay. You can see it says near U.S. Fisheries Food Products Building Exposition. I mean, this was from that World's Fair. This is where Monterey Sardines were introduced to the world. So I actually found it. I paid $40 on eBay. I was really surprised to find that card right there. So Pop leaves the Hofbrau and moves up Bush Street and opens a restaurant on Bush Street, a place morning, noon, and night, and where they're serving abalone a la Ernest in red. And Pop is recognized as the discoverer of abalone in all kinds of different forms, and solid and liquid forms. And so this restaurant lasted about a year. And there was beginnings of World War I. There were anti-German sentiments in California at that point. So they closed this restaurant. He moved back to Monterey, hooks up with the, no pun intended, with A.M. Allen, Janosuke Kadani, and moves out to Point Lobos and creates a business out with those guys creating abalone steaks. If you know Point Lobos, you go to the Whalers Cabin today, which is now a little museum. He created sort of an assembly line in that building where ladies were pounding abalone, and they were preparing it and then shipping it to various restaurants and hotels, mainly in Northern California. And then in 1990, he breaks away from Point Lobos and comes down to the Monterey Wharf and opens the very first restaurant on the Monterey Wharf. There's Pop here and that's his son Carl. And they opened the restaurant in the old Monterey Yacht Club. You can see right here, so boats for hire. So initially it was called the Club, and then he quickly changed the name to Pop Ernest, became known as the Abalone King. Abalone steaks, abalone stews, abalone salads, all kinds of different things. There's a card for the restaurant called the Club, and again, he changed the name. Of course, he was a master at marketing his restaurant. This is a very famous menu that he would use as a giveaway, and this was done by two very, very famous artists. They did it for free abalone dinners. I don't know if anybody recognized any of the artwork here, but this middle section was done by a guy named Joe Mora, and this outer section was done by a guy named Armin Hansen. And then you can see here Pop wearing the red fez. He always wore this red fez. Nobody knows why, not even his family. I believe it was something he got at that World's Fair. It actually was a marketing tool. It was something people would remember. It's people, more importantly, remembered his restaurant. They always wore that red fez right there. Another Ray Troll drawing of an abalone diver. If you look closely to the diver in the face mask there he is right there. That's my friend, old friend Roy Hattori. Right there. And Roy was the last of the Japanese abalone divers. He passed away about 10 years ago, and he was in his 90s at that time. But Roy is the only diver that was born here. He was Nisei. All the divers came to Japan, just a couple of exceptions returned to Japan. But Roy is born here just a couple hundred yards from where the Monterey Bay Aquarium is today. So after I learned how to do this, he told me that when he was a young man, he had just graduated from Monterey High School. His father wanted to get into the abalone business. During the Depression, he had a lot of debts to pay. He thought this would be a good way to make some money, but he had no experience in this business whatsoever. But he had friends who were in it. So he borrowed some equipment, takes a little boat in the middle of the Monterey Harbor. He dressed him up in this wool underwear. Divers learned long ago that they need to wear this wool underwear. In fact, that dive company in Japan was making this wool underwear strictly for the divers in California. He put on this wool underwear, puts on his clothes, puts on a big heavy canvas suit, attaches 65 pounds of lead weights to his front pack. He ties lead to his shoes. He bolts on the helmet. Then his dad just tossed him off the side of the boat. Did you start running down there? That's how he learned to be an abalone diver. Luckily, the older divers took him under the wing and kind of showed him what to do. Here's Roy here. It was his brother and cousin getting ready to go diving right here, getting dressed up there. Here's all the gear that you see here. Here's the weights and the lifeline, the dive abalone baskets here. They usually they would fill up the basket when they pull in the line, then they'd pull it back up to the surface. The collar that you'd screw the helmet down on. Here is, of course, the canvas suit. Again, all this gear came directly from Japan. They didn't like the American gear. They said it was just too rough. They didn't like to wear that stuff right there. This is the ladder that the diver would rest on as they're going from place to place or help them get in and out of the water right there. And here's Roy getting ready to go diving. He was 18 when his picture was taken. Handsome young man, as you see right there. And then here he is, getting ready to go in. So I asked Roy one time if he ever had any problems down there. And he said, you know, sometimes the current can be really strong and kick up rocks. One time a rock kicked up, hit the helmet, and cracked the glass on his helmet. I mean, you're 30 feet below the Monterey Bay and you just crack the glass on your helmet. What are you going to do? You want to get to the surface, right? It'll take a long time. So what he did, and I think this is the most remarkable thing, he reached into his abalone basket, pulls out abalone with just a big marine snail, he takes the abalone, sticks it on the glass, and the abalone fills up the crack, stops the water from coming in, goes to the surface, changes the glass, starts all over again. Pretty smart, I think. There's Roy getting ready to go dive in here. You can see by the way, look at the helmet. You'll notice all the dents on the helmet. And that's from rocks kicking up or being pushed onto a rock face underwater right there. Then you can see him. Here he is underwater, and you can see the crew. Now, by the way, they go for 3-day abalone cruises. This is just the dive boat, and then there's a big mother boat that would pull the dive boat when they weren't diving. And so here they are. Here's the hose of the diver here. This is the lifeline here, and also the line that pulled the basket back up. And then the man on the back is on the sculling oar. The scull is something they brought from Japan. And so the idea of the scull is you didn't need to use a motor. You just use that scull, then you would follow the bubbles of the diver underwater. And that way, because if you have a motor, then you could accidentally run over the diver's hose. Without this way, you wouldn't have that problem. I've been to Japan and I had the opportunity to try to use a scull on a boat. I have to tell you, it takes a lot of skill to do it. And then there was a motor, of course, on the boat when they could move it back to the mother boat. And here's where the motor is with the little cover on it. And you see Roy's shoes. And I asked him why his shoes are on there. And he said, well, when he got out of the water, he'd be really cold and that motor would be running. He could put his shoes on. That it kept his shoes warm. Also kept the tea kettle warm all the time. So they always get up hot tea when they came out of the water there. So here is a very rare picture of actually the dive boat at work here. This is taken actually at Point Sur. If anybody's been on Point Sur tour of the light station, when you walk up that road to the lighthouse, it took me a while, but I finally figured out exactly where this was taken. I'm a docent, give tours down there, and you can see here's the dive boat, and the guy on the scull right here. Here's the other two guys, and you can see the hose right here, and then here is the bubbles of the diver in the water right there. All right. Yeah, Lobos was a favorite place for the guys to go to dive down there. Abalone, this is a wonderful drawing by Bruce Aries. Abalone diver at Big Sur. Of course, she probably was a little bit deeper down there. And then here is another beautiful picture of Roy coming up out of the water. So all these great pictures of Roy Hattori, these were taken by a guy named Roy Ruppel. Ruppel was a local photographer, and actually he and Roy Hattori were Ray Ruppel. Ray and Roy were actually best friends. And Ray took these pictures. They were set up, and they took them initially with the idea of selling them to Life magazine. And Life was interested in them, so they took the photographs, they sent them to Life magazine. This was in 1938, and they held on to them. And then World War II happened, and it never got published. So luckily, these photos are today in the Monterey Library collection. They have them, so they really are wonderful photographs. And then again, here's another part of that photograph, and you can see this is Roy's brother and cousin, you see right here. And then here's just a great, this is actually a photograph that's been colored and shows the dive boat, the mother boat, pulling the dive boat into Monterey Harbor. And then they come into Monterey, into the harbor, and you can see the mother boat here, and then the diving gear here, that's just drying. Then these boxes you see in the back here, these are called live boxes. And this is, again, technology that came from Japan. And this is how they kept the abalone fresh for those 3 days that they were gone. They would pile the abalone inside these boxes, which were made locally, made out of redwood. And they pile the abalone on top of each other and keep it in the water. So while they're out diving abalone for 3 days, that kept the abalone fresh. And they bring them into Monterey. And this is at the Monterey Wharf. So prior to World War II, the majority of the businesses on the Monterey Wharf were Japanese-owned fish markets and abalone processors. There was 3 different abalone processors on the wharf. There was one large one that was kind of a co-op that a lot of different companies operated with. By 1920, there were 9 different Japanese abalone companies operating off the Monterey Wharf. In 1929, the California abalone industry brought in close to $1 million in revenue, 75% of it right here in Monterey. So very, very important industry right here. Because here's the boats here, you can see all the abalone on the deck of the boat right there. Each boat would come into Monterey after 3 days with about 200 dozen large red abalone. They'd load them into these baskets and pull them up into the canneries. You see all the ladies pulling the abalone out of the shell. All Japanese workers in these canneries. And then they would clean them, wash them, then just cutting them out of the shell right there. And then they were slicing them to make those abalone steaks, you see right there. And then they would pound it to make it nice and soft. It wasn't just women, by the way, there were men that did this, the pounded abalone. I've also had see photographs of non-Japanese guys pounding abalone. And I asked Roy Hattori about that because Roy's mother actually had a cannery, abalone cannery that she operated. And he told me that, yes, they would hire these old Sicilian guys to pound the tough steaks. And then they, of course, they were shipping it. This is how they prepared to ship it. And they go on ice off to different restaurants, hotels all over California. Or they prepare steaks to Pop's restaurant. This is a picture, of course, of Pop Ernest at his restaurant on the Monterey Wharf, taken about 1925 or so. And here's the restaurant. Much later, Pop died in 1934, and the sons continued to operate it. They operated the restaurant until about 1952, and they sold it to the Cerrito family. This is one of my favorite pictures of the restaurant. This is taken from the Custom House. So you can see the railroad tracks running right across it right there. And this is the interior of the restaurant about 1930. See all the whalebone along the side, and it's this sort of nautical theme, the abalone shells, and the lamps are all made out of abalone or different kinds of shells and things like that. And then here's Pop serving, this is 1925, serving abalone stew to these two ladies. He was famous for his abalone stew. He would actually serve it in the shell of the abalone. He'd fill up the holes of the shell with lead. And then there's this is a reproduction of the abalone stew from Pop Ernest. This was made for the museum in Tateyama, Japan, when we recreated Pop's restaurant for an exhibit that I was the co-curator of. And luckily, I was able to bring this stuff back to Monterey. So I have these things on exhibit today here at the Japanese American Cicely League Hall Heritage Museum. Pop had his own dive crew. This is his boat, the Pop Ernest. It's the only known photograph of it. And then, of course, abalone shells were illegal to ship abalone shells out of California. And so he would give these away. They dump them over the side of the wharf. Oftentimes to this day, kayakers tell me to go around the Monterey Wharf, they'll still find abalone shells there. He'd give these away to folks, or he'd sell them for really cheap prices. Anybody who takes a tour around old Monterey neighborhoods, oftentimes you'll see the gardens or have abalone inlay, or they're built around abalone shells. This is where they got those shells. All kinds of things. Or they truck these shells out to Seaside and Sand City and Marina and just dumped them in the sand dunes out there. And all kinds of things were developed because of that shell. This is actually a photograph taken about 1900. Manuel Duarte's store is for the first Marine Museum. Again, see all the abalone shells here, and all kinds of abalone products they were selling to the tourists. Whalebone products here, whalebone vertebrae with the caramel mission painted on it. That's a whalebone chair right there. But they were making all kinds of abalone things, cars, pieces of the caramel mission with abalone inlay in it. This is another gentleman named Joseph Smith who did the same kind of thing. His business was in the first theater at that time. That has had a sand floor, but you could see all the abalone shell he was selling to the tourists at the 17-mile or on the 17-mile drive. You see right there. And then again, the shells are being dumped out in Seaside or Marina. This is one of those abalone piles. And then there was a company in Southern California called SLAM, S-L-A-M, who were purchasing these shells and trucking them down to Southern California, and they were creating all kinds of different products. They were selling all over the world, all over the United States. This is some of that product. This is, of course, an airplane thermometer on it. This one's from Salinas, California, souvenir of Salinas. Here's an exhibit I have here at the ACL Heritage Museum, all these abalone products, mostly abalone from Monterey. What they do is they cut the abalone and they cut a piece of redwood and then glue the abalone shell onto that. Again, look, notice all the thermometers you see here. And I have all these pieces all over different states, Ohio and Michigan, and nothing says Michigan like abalone, right? There you go. So there's all kinds of different products you see right there. This beautiful shell, this was a beautiful abalone shell that was in 1908, was given to the Secretary of the Navy, Victor Metcalf. In 1908, Teddy Roosevelt's Great White Fleet which is on a world trip around the world to eventually sail into Tokyo Bay. And the reason they were doing that is they were concerned about Japan and its mighty military. And so the United States sent this great white fleet around to show how powerful we were. And so they stopped various different communities, including Monterey. And this was a gift that the Monterey Chamber of Commerce had made. A Japanese company made this. And there was they had a business on the wharf that was polishing abalone shells. And they presented this to Victor Metcalf. The Japanese company also made the box that it comes in, which is made out of cypress. And Metcalf actually never came to Monterey. He was in San Francisco. And they took it up to him in San Francisco. But for some reason that I've never been able to find out, he didn't take it. He didn't accept the gift, or he forgot it. We don't know why, but ended up back in Monterey, where he eventually ended up at the Monterey Maritime Museum. And today he is now here at the Japanese American Sicily Heritage Museum. That's where it is. All right, so here's another wonderful piece of that souvenir of Alabama there. I love those pieces. And this is a leather postcard, popular at the turn of the 20th century. This dates about 1905 or so. Shall I see you soon? Monterey. And then I appreciate your service. I apologize for the technical things. I know not too bad. So I appreciate if anybody have any questions, I'm more than happy to answer anybody's questions. Thank you. See if I can figure out how here. All right.
Thank you, Tim, for that wonderful presentation. Greatly appreciate it. We have quite a few questions in the chat. We'll start off. So someone asked, the Japanese Heritage Museum is local in Monterey. It's at 424 Adams Street.
Correct.
When is the museum open?
Because the museum closed, we opened it right before the pandemic hit. Then we had to close it. And we're just getting ready to reopen right now. We just painted a big mural, which was completed today on the outside of our museum, and then putting a garden in. So the plans are to open it early next year in January to the public, grand reopening. But I will invite anybody who is in the audience today, if you're interested. All you have to do is email me, and we can set up a time, and I will be more than happy to open it up and show it to you.
Thank you. And I'll put Tim's email address in the chat.
Correct.
Next question. Notice that the later photos of Roy is on abalone boats that don't appear to have two men air pumps, like the ones on display at the whaler's cabin to keep the divers from air. What technology replaced the manual pumps?
Air compressors that ran with a gasoline engine, which were brought in the 1920s. So with the hand pumps, the divers could stay down only so long. That, because it just took a lot to pump those things. Usually, sometimes 4 guys are on those pumps. But when you're running a motor, then the divers would be down all day. So typical daily business for a diver, he'd go down into the water about 9 o'clock. He'd be underwater collecting abalone till about 12 o'clock, go to the surface, have lunch. Then at 1 o'clock, he'd go back down into the water, down to about 4 o'clock, and come back up for the end of the day. And that was a typical day for an abalone diver.
Thank you. Next question is, do you know why it was illegal to ship abalone shells outside of California?
Sure, it was really a racist thing. With a lot of anti-Japanese sentiment in the United States at that time. There was concern coming from Chamber of Commerce along the coast where abalone was, particularly in Monterey area, where tourists, as I mentioned, were taking abalone shells as souvenirs. All kinds of businesses were creating those abalone products, and they were concerned they were going to take too much abalone shell, so they were trying to control it to do that. But the Japanese were not doing, they were, and Kadro Kadani, who was a trained biologist, this is before the turn of the 20th century. In 1898, the Monterey County Board of Supervisors actually passed a law saying the Japanese could not dive abalone north of the Carmel River, really between Carmel River and the Monterey Wharf, tried to control that whole thing. And Kodani said, no, we're taking the larger ones after they've already reproduced. but that didn't matter. And so that law actually, I believe, is almost still in existence, but they really put that in there and it ran.
Thank you. Next question. And if anyone would like to unmute themselves and ask questions, please feel free to, or you can put it in the chat and I can read it out. Our next question, A.L. Scrap Lundy's book is my go-to reference for Monterey abalone industry. Was he involved in the industry or was he just a historian?
Well, Scrap was a diver. I knew Scrap pretty well. And he was a commercial diver, I think at one point. He was actually a lawyer, an accountant, and but he was a diver. He's heavily involved with the Historic Diving League in California. He and has had a fascination in this industry. He's from the Santa Barbara area. He passed away a few years ago, but yeah, his book is an excellent book.
Thank you. Next question. I've heard that it's toxic to polish or cut the abalone shell. Is that true?
Yes, it is true. And so today it's highly recommended to wear goggles, to wear some kind of ventilator mask when you're polishing abalone.
Very interesting. I didn't know they're poisonous.
Yeah. Well, it can cause a lot of problems.
Next question. Do you know how old those big abalone in the photos with pop were?
Yeah, well, abalone grows very slow. In the farm situation, it grows about 1 inch a year. In the wild, it's much slower. So those large abalone, like the one I showed you, of the pictures of those large abalone shells that I took in Japan, those shells could be well over 100 years old. The abalone would be to get to be that size.
Wow. Thank you. And if the floor is open, if anyone has any questions for Tim. So I have a question, Tim. Do we still have the abalone industry here today? What is it like nowadays?
No, there is no commercial abalone industry in California at all. It actually ended in the mid-1990s. Monterey, as I mentioned, was the center of the universe for abalone till about the early 1960s. And then it began to shift to Southern California, continued to Southern California, really Santa Barbara, Morro Bay area was really a big abalone industry down there. But beginning in the 80s and 90s, there were a number of El Nino storms that tore up kelp beds. And then in the late 1980s and 90s, there was a disease called the withering foot disease that heavily hit the abalone. And what it does is it forces the abalone to shrink in its shell, and it can't latch onto anything, and so it can't protect itself. So the California Department of Fish and Game closed the commercial fishery down in the mid-1990s. Then you could sport fish for abalone north of the Golden Gate. But they shut that down a few years ago, so you can't even sport fish for it anymore.
Thank you. Chase, or I see a question in the audience. You're on mute. Sir, you're muted.
Okay. I'm a longtime abalone diver. I was just going to mention that we can no longer sport dive for abalone anymore. Since 2017 was our last year we could do that. And
thank you.
2026 is the soonest we're going to be able to, but it is unlikely for all those reasons that Tim mentioned. And so.
Thank you.
Sure.
All right, well, if there's no more questions, we will wrap this up. Special thanks to Tim Thomas for the amazing presentation. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon.
I think I should mention, my guest today is supposed to be RCD at Monterey Abalone Farm. So they do farm raised abalone today. Monterey has 2 of them. Pop Ernest actually was the first guy to try abalone farm, which he did in 1925. He bought some property down in the Big Sur area, Anderson Creek area, and created an abalone farm. Worked with the scientists at the time, but they could never get the abalone to reproduce at that point, so it never was successful. But the Japanese have been farming abalone for over 100 years, And they have massive farms in Japan. I've been to some of them. But today we do farm raise it here, and there are 2 of them here in Monterey. So thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Tim.
Thank
and
you.
Thank you everyone for joining us. We will be back next month on December 16th. We will be back. Tim will be talking about, Tim, would you like to talk about your next program?
Sure, we're going to have Peter Hiller, and we're going to talk about, Peter Hiller is the expert on Joe Mora, and we're going to talk about Joe Mora and his artwork and the Monterey Peninsula.
Thank you. So if that interests anyone, please feel free to register on the library's event page. And if you want to catch this recording again, it will be available on the library's, Monterey Public Library's YouTube channel. So thank you again, Tim, and thank you everyone for joining us, and have a great evening.